James Mercer stared at the numbers on his computer screen and rubbed his tired eyes. As CEO of Sunrise Manufacturing, he should have been pleased with the company's growth over the past 5 years. Sales were up, and they had expanded to 3 new locations, but something wasn't right. These turnover rates can't be normal, he muttered to himself, scrolling through the latest quarterly reports. Almost 40% of their workforce had left in the past year, most from their main production facility in Oakland. The exit interviews showed a pattern: lack of recognition, poor management, no room for growth. A knock on his office door broke his concentration. His assistant Raj poked his head in. "Your 3 o'clock with the board is in 5 minutes, sir." James nodded, gathering his papers. "Thanks, Raj. And could you find me those employee satisfaction surveys from last quarter? The ones from the Oakland plant specifically." "Already on your desk, sir," Raj replied with a knowing smile. "I figured you'd want another look." As James walked the long hallway to the conference room, he couldn't help but notice how disconnected he felt. His office occupied the top floor of their gleaming headquarters, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern art. When was the last time he'd actually been on a production floor? 2 years? Maybe 3? The board meeting dragged on with discussions of profit margins and expansion plans. But James found his mind wandering back to those employee surveys and exit interviews. "And so, as you can see, we're projecting a 15% increase in..." The financial director's voice faded into the background as James remembered something his father had told him when he first started the company 25 years ago. "A business is only as good as how it treats the people at the bottom of the ladder," his father had said. "The day you forget that is the day your company starts dying." "James, your thoughts?" The board chair's voice snapped him back to attention. "I think," James said slowly, an idea forming, "that we may have a blind spot. Our profits look strong, but something's happening with our workforce that numbers alone aren't showing us." Later that evening, James sat in his home office, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face as he scrolled through news articles. An image caught his eye: another CEO who had gone undercover in his own company to see firsthand what was happening. The results had been eye-opening. His wife Priya walked in with 2 cups of tea. "Still working? It's almost midnight." James accepted the steaming cup. "I'm thinking about doing something unusual." Priya raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." He explained his idea: to go undercover as an entry-level worker in the Oakland facility for 2 weeks. No special treatment, no corner office, just a mop, a uniform, and a chance to see his company through the eyes of those who kept it running. "The board will think you've lost your mind," Priya said, but her eyes showed approval. "But I think it's exactly what you and your company needs." The next morning, James called a private meeting with only his most trusted executives: Raj, his assistant of 15 years, Diane, his HR director, and Tom, his oldest friend and COO. "You want to do what?" Tom nearly spilled his coffee when James outlined his plan. "I need to see what's really happening," James insisted. "All we have are numbers and anonymous surveys. I need to feel it." Diane nodded slowly. "The Oakland plant would be perfect. It's our largest facility, and where we've seen the most problems. But James, you can't just walk in there. Everyone knows what you look like." "That's where you come in," James smiled. "I need a disguise, a backstory, and for the 3 of you to cover for me for 2 weeks." What followed was a whirlwind of preparation. Diane created a fake employee file for Mark Johnson, a new maintenance worker with basic experience. Raj reworked James's schedule, postponing meetings and arranging for him to work remotely on an important project. Tom reluctantly agreed to handle any emergencies that might arise. The physical transformation was the most dramatic part. James visited a stylist who dyed his distinctive silver-streaked hair to a nondescript brown. He grew out his stubble into a short beard. Colored contacts changed his blue eyes to brown. He practiced walking differently, less confident, more hesitant. He bought clothes from a discount store: faded jeans, worn work boots, plain t-shirts. The night before his first day on the job, James stood before his bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing himself. The CEO had vanished, replaced by an ordinary middle-aged man who might go unnoticed in any crowd. "You look different," Priya said from the doorway, concern in her voice. "That's the idea," James replied, tugging at his ill-fitting shirt. Designer suits had been his uniform for so long that the rough cotton felt strange against his skin. "I meant your eyes," she said softly. "You look nervous. I haven't seen you nervous since you pitched your first major client 20 years ago." James exhaled slowly. "I am nervous. What if this whole thing is a mistake? What if I'm discovered? Worse, what if I find out I've been completely wrong about how my company operates?" Priya crossed the room and straightened his collar, a familiar gesture that somehow felt different with him in these new clothes. "Finding out you're wrong isn't the worst thing, James. Not trying to find out at all. That would be the mistake." He nodded, knowing she was right. He'd built Sunrise Manufacturing from nothing, working countless 14-hour days, sacrificing time with family and friends. The company was his life's work. If something was broken within it, he needed to know. The alarm rang at 4:30 a.m., an hour he hadn't seen in years unless he was catching an early flight. The Oakland facility's first shift began at 6 a.m., and Mark Johnson wouldn't have the luxury of a private driver or a reserved parking space. James drove himself in a used Honda that Tom had helped him purchase through a third party. As he joined the stream of workers trudging through the employee entrance, ID badge clipped to his belt, he felt a flutter of anxiety. The security guard barely glanced at him as he swiped his badge. The employee locker room was cramped and smelled of industrial cleaner. Men and women in various uniforms chatted, laughed, complained about supervisors, discussed weekend plans. No one paid attention to the new guy as James stowed his lunch in a small locker. "You the new maintenance guy?" A gruff voice behind him made James turn. A heavy-set man with kind eyes and weathered hands extended his hand. "I'm Eduardo. They said you'd be shadowing me this week." James shook the offered hand, noting the calluses. Mark Johnson. First day." Eduardo nodded. "Stick with me. I'll show you how things really work around here." Something in the way he said, "really," made James think there was a story behind it. As they headed toward the maintenance office to collect their supplies for the day, James took in his surroundings with new eyes. The facility was clean and efficient. He'd always insisted on that, but signs of neglect showed in small ways. Flickering lights that hadn't been replaced. A water fountain with an out-of-order sign dated 3 months ago. Break room chairs held together with duct tape. How had he missed these details during his official tours? The answer was obvious because no one would allow the CEO to see them. Eduardo handed him a push broom, interrupting his thoughts. "We start in Section C. Production doesn't begin for another 30 minutes, so we can get the floors done before the machines start up. You ever worked maintenance before?" James thought of his cover story. "Some. Different company, though. Smaller place." Eduardo nodded, apparently satisfied with this vague answer. "Well, different place, same dirt, let's go. And keep your eyes open. Around here you see a lot if you're invisible, and believe me, to most people in charge, we're invisible." As James followed Eduardo through the awakening factory, push broom in hand, he couldn't help but wonder what else had been invisible to him all these years. But he was about to find out. The factory floor hummed with activity as Eduardo led James through his first morning. The noise was overwhelming. Machines whirring, forklifts beeping, the constant chatter of workers calling to each other over the din. James had visited this facility dozens of times for official tours, but he'd never experienced it like this. Without the advance notice, without managers frantically cleaning up problems before his arrival, without the respectful hush that fell whenever he entered a room. "We start with the main walkways," Eduardo explained, demonstrating the proper sweeping technique. "Always push the debris away from the production lines. Safety first." James nodded, mimicking Eduardo's movements. Within 15 minutes, his back was already complaining. By 30 minutes, he felt the first blisters forming on his hands. How did Eduardo, who had to be at least 10 years older than James's 52 years, make this look so effortless? "You're Gripping the broom too tight, Eduardo said, noticing James's discomfort. Relax your hands. Let the broom do the work. A group of line workers passed by, nodding respectfully to Eduardo. Morning, Mr. Eduardo, a young woman called out. Coffee's fresh in the break room. Thanks, Tanya, Eduardo replied with a warm smile. This is Mark. He's new. Tanya offered James a quick hello before hurrying off to her station. James was struck by the interaction, so different from how people normally greeted him, with their nervous smiles and carefully rehearsed pleasantries. You seem popular, James commented as they continued sweeping. Eduardo shrugged. Been here 15 years. You get to know people. He paused, then added, most of them anyway. As the morning progressed, James observed Eduardo's routine. The man was methodical, thorough, and seemed to know every inch of the facility. He checked things that weren't even on his official task list, tightening a loose bolt here, adjusting a misaligned guardrail there. That's not our job, James said when Eduardo stopped to fix a leaking water cooler. Eduardo raised an eyebrow. Maybe not officially, but if I don't do it, who will? Put in a work order and it sits in the system. For weeks. Meanwhile, people don't have drinking water. The statement hit James hard. Was that true? Were maintenance requests really ignored for weeks? He made a mental note to check the work order system when he got back to being CEO. At lunch, James expected Eduardo to join the crowded tables in the cafeteria. Instead, the older man led him to a quieter corner near a window overlooking the loading docks. You don't eat with the others? James asked, unwrapping his sandwich. Eduardo shook his head. Used to. These days, I prefer the quiet. A group of supervisors entered the cafeteria, led by a tall man in a crisp button-down shirt and khakis. The energy in the room shifted subtly. Conversations quieted, postures straightened. Who's that? James asked, though he already knew from company photos. Scott Blackwell, the regional manager appointed 2 years ago after a series of impressive performances at their Arizona location. Scott Blackwell. Regional manager. Eduardo's tone was carefully neutral, but James caught the slight tension in his shoulders. He runs things his way. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Eduardo took a long sip of his coffee before answering. Depends on who you ask. Numbers are up. That's what matters to the higher-ups, right? Before James could respond, a loud laugh drew their attention. Scott was telling a story to his group, gesturing broadly. And then I told him, that's why they pay me the big bucks and you push a broom. The supervisors laughed on cue. James noticed Eduardo staring out the window, pretending not to hear. After lunch, they moved to the storage areas behind the main production floor. James was surprised to find a small notebook in Eduardo's pocket, filled with detailed notes. What's this for? James asked as Eduardo jotted something down. Keeping track of inventory. Supply chain's been a mess since COVID. If I don't write down what we're low on, stuff doesn't get ordered until we're completely out. But isn't there an inventory system for that? Eduardo's laugh was short and without humor. Sure, in theory. But systems only work when people use them right. The computer says we have 50 light bulbs in stock. Half the time, there's maybe 10. I've stopped trusting anything but my own eyes. Throughout the afternoon, James noticed how people reacted to Eduardo, with genuine respect, not the forced deference he usually received as CEO. A line worker asked Eduardo's advice on fixing her machine rather than waiting for technical support. A new hire looked to him for guidance when a supervisor's instructions were unclear. Even the janitor consulted Eduardo about which cleaning solution would work best on a stubborn stain. What struck James most was how Eduardo treated everyone, with the same respectful attention, from the newest hire to the few executives who occasionally walked through on their way to meetings. No one was beneath his notice. No question too small to deserve his full consideration. When the day finally ended, James's body ached in ways he hadn't experienced in decades. His hands were blistered despite the gloves Eduardo had lent him. His back screamed in protest and his feet felt like they'd been pounded with hammers. First day's the hardest, Eduardo said, seeing James's exhaustion. Gets easier. James nodded, too tired to speak. As they clocked out, he noticed Eduardo checking his watch and hurrying toward the exit. Got somewhere to be? James asked. Community college night classes, Eduardo replied. Teaching myself some new skills. What kind of skills? James was genuinely curious. Eduardo seemed hesitant to answer. Engineering courses, probably silly at my age, but he shrugged. Never too late to learn, right? The next morning, James arrived early, finding Eduardo already there inspecting the cleaning equipment before their shift. You're always first in, James observed. Got into the habit years ago, Eduardo replied. I like the quiet before everyone arrives. Gives me time to think. As they worked through the morning, James found himself drawn into conversation with Eduardo, careful to maintain his cover while trying to understand this man who seemed to embody everything James had once wanted his company to be. Been here 15 years, Eduardo said when James asked about his history with the company. Started when Mr. Mercer first opened this location. The CEO, James asked, feeling strange discussing himself. Eduardo nodded. He used to visit regularly, back then. Knew everyone's names, would walk the floor, ask questions, listen to suggestions. His voice held a note of something like disappointment. That was a long time ago. Company's bigger now, things change. James felt a pang of guilt. When had he stopped those floor walks? When had he stopped learning names? Probably around the time Sunrise had opened its third location, and he'd become more focused on growth and investors than on the people who made that growth possible. During a maintenance call to fix a broken conveyor belt, James watched Eduardo interact with the line workers. They clearly respected him, but there was something else in their interactions, a sense of camaraderie that transcended job titles. How do you do that? James asked afterward. Do what? Make everyone feel. James searched for the right word. Valued. Eduardo considered the question. Most people just want to be seen, to know their work matters. Not that complicated, really. He adjusted his tool belt. Problem is, the people in charge forget what it's like to be invisible. Easy to forget people when you don't have to look them in the eye every day. The words hit James with unexpected force. How many decisions had he made from his corner office without considering the human impact? How many times had he celebrated efficiency gains without questioning the cost to employee morale? On their third day together, James noticed Eduardo sitting alone during lunch again, this time with a textbook open beside his sandwich. Mind if I join you? James asked, tray in hand. Eduardo moved his book to make room. Advanced Mechanical Engineering, James noted, glancing at the cover. Just trying to keep the old brain working, Eduardo said, looking slightly embarrassed. You're interested in engineering? Eduardo was quiet for a moment. I was an engineer, back in my country. Had a degree and everything. But here. He shrugged. Credentials didn't transfer. Had to start over, take whatever job I could get. James was stunned. An engineer with 15 years of loyalty to the company still pushing a broom? Have you ever applied for other positions here? A shadow crossed Eduardo's face. 4 times for maintenance supervisor, twice for junior engineer. Positions, always the same answer. We've gone with someone with more relevant experience. That's not right, James said before he could stop himself. That's life, Eduardo replied simply. But I still have ideas. Still try to make things better where I can. As they headed back to work, James noticed Eduardo stopping to help a young woman struggling with a jammed machine. Thanks, Mr. Eduardo, she said when the machine started running again. I was afraid I'd get written up for missing my quota. No problem, Lily. Just remember to check the tension belt first next time. The genuine gratitude in her eyes stayed with James throughout the afternoon. When had anyone last looked at him that way? With the unguarded appreciation of someone who had been truly helped. By the end of the 4th day, James had begun to see his company through new eyes. The shiny quarterly reports and slick presentations he usually relied on told only part of the story. They didn't show the broken chairs in the break room, the outdated training materials, or the way certain supervisors spoke to their teams when they thought no one important was listening. They didn't show Eduardo with his engineering degree and 15 years of loyalty, still being passed over for advancement while contributing ideas that no one bothered to hear. As James drove home that evening, he couldn't help but wonder what else he had been missing all these years, and what was going to happen when he finally witnessed it firsthand. James arrived at work on his fourth day feeling different. The muscle soreness from his first days had settled into a dull ache, and he found himself falling into the rhythm of the job more naturally. Even more surprising was the realization that he was actually looking forward to seeing Eduardo again. Their conversations had become the highlight of his undercover experience. Today they were assigned to clean the administrative section of the building, an area James knew well from the other side, as the person whose office was being cleaned, not the person doing the cleaning. "Morning." Eduardo greeted him with a nod. "Ready for a change of scenery? Admin wing's a different world." James soon understood what Eduardo meant. The contrast between the factory floor and the administrative offices was stark. Plush carpeting instead of concrete, ergonomic chairs instead of metal stools, a high-end coffee machine instead of the basic drip coffee maker in the workers' break room. "Feels like a different company," James commented as they collected trash from the offices. "It is a different company, depending on which side of the door you work on," Eduardo replied without bitterness, just stating a fact. Not complaining, though. That's just how things are everywhere. Big bosses need nice offices to impress clients. James felt a twinge of guilt, remembering his own spacious corner office with its expensive furniture and personal bathroom. Had he ever truly considered how that disparity might look to someone who couldn't even get a water cooler fixed in a timely manner? Around mid-morning, they reached the supervisor offices, a row of glass-walled rooms where the department managers and regional supervisors worked. Most were empty, their occupants in meetings or on the production floor. "We'll do the vacuuming during lunch when they're all out," Eduardo explained. "For now, just empty trash bins and dust. Try not to disturb anything on the desks." James nodded and began working through the offices one by one. He was emptying a trash bin in the far corner when he heard voices approaching, one of them unmistakably Scott Blackwell's. "Just check the numbers yourself if you don't believe me," Scott was saying to someone. "Production's up 18% since I took over. That's what matters to headquarters." James froze. He was partly hidden by a filing cabinet, but if Scott entered the office, he'd be spotted immediately. Instinctively, he knelt down and pretended to be tying his shoe while gathering trash from the floor, making himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Scott stopped just outside the office, continuing his conversation in the hallway. Through the glass, James could see Eduardo approaching with a broom, preparing to sweep the corridor. "Morning, Mr. Blackwell," Eduardo said politely as he passed. Scott barely acknowledged him with a nod before turning back to his conversation. But as Eduardo moved away, Scott lowered his voice and said something to his companion that made them both laugh while looking in Eduardo's direction. James felt a flare of anger, but reminded himself to stay in character. He finished with the trash and slipped out of the office, moving to the next one. From his new position, he could still hear Scott and the other supervisor in the hallway. The next 20 minutes passed uneventfully, with James and Eduardo continuing their work as the office gradually filled with staff returning from morning meetings. James had almost forgotten the earlier interaction when a commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Eduardo was on a small ladder, changing a light bulb in the ceiling fixture outside Scott's office. Scott emerged from a meeting room with two other supervisors talking loudly about quarterly targets. "Johnson, I need that equipment report by end of day," Scott called to one of the passing supervisors without breaking stride. Then he noticed Eduardo on the ladder and stopped abruptly. "That light's been out for 3 weeks, Scott said, his tone accusatory. "Why is it only being fixed now?" Eduardo climbed down carefully before answering. "Work order just came through." "Yesterday, sir." Scott shook his head. "Maintenance is always behind. Maybe if you people moved a little faster, we wouldn't have to work in the dark." "The work order system has a backlog," Eduardo explained calmly. "We prioritize safety issues first, then—" "I don't need excuses," Scott cut him off. "Just do your job faster." James watched from inside the adjacent office, his hands tightening around the trash bag he was holding. The disrespect in Scott's tone was unmistakable. Eduardo simply nodded. "Yes, sir. We're doing our best with the current staffing levels." Scott snorted. Your best? That's the problem right there. Some people's best just isn't good enough. Two supervisors with Scott shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. James expected Eduardo to walk away at that point, but to his surprise, the maintenance worker stood his ground. Mr. Blackwell, while I have you here, I wanted to mention that the conveyor system in Section D is showing signs of potential failure. The bearings are making a noise that suggests... Scott laughed, cutting him off again. Now the janitor thinks... He's an engineer. Listen to this, guys. James flinched at the word janitor, a deliberate mischaracterization of Eduardo's maintenance role and one clearly meant to diminish him. Eduardo's face remained impassive. I've worked with those machines for 15 years. I recognize the sound of failing bearings. If we don't address it soon, we could have a major breakdown that would halt production for days. And how much would your solution cost? Scott asked, making air quotes. About $600 for parts plus labor, Eduardo replied promptly. Much less than the thousands we'd lose from a shutdown, not to mention the potential safety risks. Scott looked at his companions and rolled his eyes. I have actual engineers who make these assessments. I don't need maintenance staff playing pretend expert. He turned to walk away, then added over his shoulder, stick to changing light bulbs. That's what you're paid for. James was so shocked by the exchange that he nearly revealed himself. Only years of corporate discipline kept him silent, though his face burned with anger. Eduardo said nothing more, simply returning to his ladder to finish the light replacement. His face betrayed no emotion, but James noticed how his shoulders had tensed, how the careful movements of his hands had become slightly more rigid. Later, as they collected their cleaning supplies to move to the next section, James couldn't contain himself any longer. That was completely unprofessional, he said in a low voice. The way he spoke to you. Eduardo glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. That was nothing. Just another Tuesday. He shrugged. You get used to it. You shouldn't have to get used to it, James insisted, genuinely disturbed. People like us are invisible most of the time, Eduardo said quietly, which has its advantages. You hear things when people don't think you're listening or don't care if you are. They worked in silence for a while, but James could tell Eduardo was bothered by the interaction more than he let on. There was a new heaviness to his movements, a slight distance in his usually attentive responses. At lunch, they took their usual spot in the corner of the cafeteria. Eduardo opened his engineering textbook, but seemed to be staring at the same page without reading. Have you ever reported how he speaks to you? James asked carefully. Eduardo gave a small, humorless laugh. To who? HR? They report to him. His boss? They're friends from college. The CEO? He hasn't set foot on this floor in years except for carefully staged visits. The words stung, all the more because James knew they were true. His visits had become exactly that. Carefully staged affairs where problems were hidden and everything was made to look perfect. Their conversation was interrupted when Scott entered the cafeteria with his usual group of supervisors. They took their regular table near the center of the room, voices carrying as they discussed weekend plans. James tried to focus on his sandwich, but his ears perked up when he heard Eduardo's name mentioned. He glanced over to see Scott leaning in toward his group, speaking just loudly enough that his voice carried to nearby tables. I don't care if he's been here 15 years. Anyone can push a broom and change light bulbs, Scott was saying. These old-timers think longevity equals value. Eduardo kept his eyes on his book, but James could tell he was listening. The janitor thinks he's an engineer now, Scott continued, clearly enjoying his audience's chuckles. Next thing you know, he'll want my job. One of the younger supervisors looked uncomfortable. He does seem to know a lot about the equipment, though. Remember when he predicted that motor failure last month? Scott waved his hand dismissively. Blind luck. These old-timers think loyalty counts for something. It's pathetic. They don't understand that in today's business world you're only as good as your last quarter. Eduardo quietly closed his book and packed up his lunch, though he'd eaten barely, half of it. I need to check on something in the maintenance office, he said to James, his voice carefully controlled. James nodded, watching Eduardo walk away with his back straight and his head high despite the humiliation he'd just endured. The dignity in that simple act struck James deeply. When Eduardo was gone, James remained at the table, listening as Scott continued his commentary. "Gotta clear out the deadwood," Scott was saying. "That's what headquarters doesn't understand. You can't improve numbers by keeping people around just because they've been here forever. Loyalty is overrated. Results are what matter." James thought about the results he'd been celebrating in board meetings, the efficiency gains, the productivity improvements, the cost-cutting measures. Had they all come at the expense of people like Eduardo? Had he been complicit in creating a culture where longtime employees were seen as deadwood rather than valuable repositories of company knowledge and experience? The afternoon dragged on endlessly. Eduardo was quieter than usual, focusing intently on each task. James tried several times to engage him in conversation, but received only brief, polite responses. As their shift neared its end, they were assigned to clean the conference rooms on the administrative floor. In the largest room, where the executive team held their monthly meetings, James noticed Eduardo pausing to look at the wall of framed photographs, pictures showing the company's history, including its founder and current CEO. Eduardo stood before a picture of James from about 10 years ago, at the opening ceremony for the Oakland facility. In the photo, James was cutting a ribbon surrounded by smiling employees. Eduardo was among them, standing near the front, looking much younger and more hopeful. "That was a good day," Eduardo said softly, not realizing James was watching him. "We all believed in something then." James felt as though someone had punched him in the stomach. What had happened to that company, to that leader who had inspired such hope? Eduardo turned and saw James. For a moment, there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness perhaps, or disappointment, before his professional mask slipped back into place. "We should finish up," Eduardo said. "Day's almost over." As they put away their equipment at the end of the shift, James noticed Eduardo checking his watch repeatedly. "No classes tonight?" James asked. Eduardo shook his head. "Taking a personal day tomorrow. Need to take care of some things." "Everything okay?" James couldn't help but ask, concerned by the unusual request from someone who had perfect attendance for 15 years. Eduardo hesitated, then said simply, "Some decisions need to be made, that's all." As they walked to the parking lot, James felt a growing sense of unease. Something had changed in Eduardo today. A light had dimmed, a resilience had cracked. The man who had patiently endured 15 years of underappreciation seemed to have reached some kind of breaking point. "See you Monday," James said as they reached Eduardo's old sedan. Eduardo nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made James wonder if that was true. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Good night, Mark." As James watched Eduardo drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling that unless something changed, and changed quickly, the company was about to lose much more than just a maintenance worker. James couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eduardo's face, the quiet dignity masking a deep hurt, the resignation in his eyes as Scott mocked him in front of others. It wasn't just about one man's feelings being hurt. It was about what his company had become under his watch. In the comfort of his home, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd worked so hard to achieve, James felt hollow. The quarterly reports and profit margins he'd celebrated seemed meaningless compared to the human cost he was now witnessing firsthand. "You're quiet tonight," Priya said, joining him on the back porch where he sat staring into the darkness. "Rough day undercover?" James nodded slowly. I think I've been doing this all wrong. For years." "The undercover thing, running?" "The company," he clarified. "I've been celebrating numbers without understanding what those numbers actually mean on the ground." He told her about Eduardo, his engineering degree, his 15 years of loyalty, the innovations he'd suggested that were ignored, the casual cruelty he endured daily. "And the thing is," James concluded, "he's probably not the only one. How many Eduardos do we have?" People with talent and dedication who we treat as invisible? Priya listened quietly, then asked the question that had been haunting him all evening. So what are you going to do about it? The next morning, Saturday, James made a decision. He wasn't scheduled to work weekends in his undercover role, but he knew Eduardo had mentioned taking care of some things today. On a hunch, he drove to the plant. The weekend shift was smaller with a different maintenance crew. James nodded to the security guard, who barely glanced at his badge before waving him through. Inside, he found the maintenance office empty except for a weekend supervisor he didn't recognize. Looking for Eduardo, James explained. Heard he might be in today. The supervisor shook his head. He called in for a personal day, first one in 3 years, must be something important. James thanked him and left, wondering what to do next. As he walked through the parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text from Diane in HR. Need to talk. Eduardo Torres submitted resignation letter last night via email, effective immediately. James stared at the message in disbelief. Eduardo was quitting? After 15 years? He quickly texted back. Reason given? Diane's response came moments later. Personal reasons. But he dropped off his keys and badge at security after hours. That's not normal procedure, something happened. James's mind raced. This was worse than he'd feared. He needed to find Eduardo, to talk to him before it was too late. But how? He'd never asked where Eduardo lived, and personnel files weren't accessible on weekends. Then he remembered Eduardo had mentioned taking night classes at the community college. It was a long shot, but maybe someone there would know how to reach him. The campus was quiet on Saturday with only a few weekend classes in session. James found the engineering department offices locked, but noticed a faculty member working in an adjacent lab. Excuse me, James said, knocking on the open door. I'm trying to find a student, Eduardo Torres. He takes evening engineering classes. The professor looked up from his computer. Eduardo, one of my best students, but he's not here today. He studied James curiously. Are you a friend? Co-worker, James replied. It's important that I find him. Something in James's tone must have conveyed his urgency. The professor hesitated, then said, he mentioned doing some job interviews today. Said something about a position at Valencia Manufacturing. James felt his stomach drop. Valencia was Sunrise's biggest competitor. They'd been trying to poach talent for years. Thanking the professor, James hurried back to his car and called Tom, his COO. I need everything we have on Valencia's hiring. Are they recruiting engineers? Tom sounded confused. James? What's going on? Thought you were deep undercover. No time to explain. Just tell me. Is Valencia hiring engineers right now? Actually, yes. They've been expanding their R&D department. Rumor is they're developing some new production method that could cut costs by 30%. Why? I'll explain later. Text me their address. 30 minutes later, James sat in Valencia's visitor parking lot feeling both ridiculous and desperate. What was he doing here? Eduardo could be anywhere. And even if he was inside, what right did James have to interfere with his decision to leave? But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one employee. It was about fixing something broken at the core of his company. As James debated his next move, he spotted a familiar figure exiting the building. Eduardo, dressed in a suit and tie rather than his usual work clothes, looking tired but somehow lighter. James got out of his car and approached him. Eduardo. Eduardo turned, surprise flashing across his face as he recognized Mark. What are you doing here? Looking for you, James said honestly. Heard you quit. Wanted to make sure you're okay. Eduardo studied him with a puzzled expression. How did you find me? Your professor mentioned you had interviews today. I took a chance. Eduardo's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would a maintenance worker I've known for less than a week track me down on a Saturday? James took a deep breath. This wasn't how he'd planned to reveal himself, but he had no choice now. Because I'm not a maintenance worker, he admitted. My name isn't Mark Johnson. Recognition dawned slowly on Eduardo's face as he really looked at James for the first time. You're... His voice trailed off in disbelief. James Mercer, he confirmed. CEO of Sunrise. Eduardo took a step back, shock and confusion warring on his face. This was some kind of test? You were spying on us? Not a test, James said quickly. I wanted to see what was really happening in my company, not the polished version I get shown on official visits. Eduardo's expression hardened. Well now, congratulations. He turned to walk away. Please wait, James called after him. Can we talk? Just give me 15 minutes. Eduardo hesitated, then gestured to a nearby bench. They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Eduardo spoke. So you've been pretending all week. Was it entertaining watching us from your disguise? The bitterness in his voice made James wince. It wasn't like that. I was concerned about turnover rates, declining morale. Numbers on a page don't tell the whole story. And now you have your story, Eduardo said flatly. Good for you. I saw how Scott treated you, James said quietly. I heard what he said in the cafeteria. Eduardo's jaw tightened. That was nothing new, been happening for years. I know, that's the problem. James leaned forward. I let it happen. I wasn't paying attention to the right things. Why are you here? Eduardo asked directly. What do you want from me? James considered the question carefully. Honestly, I want you to not go to Valencia. I want you to give Sunrise another chance. Eduardo gave a short, humorless laugh. Why would I do that? I've given Sunrise 15 years of chances. Because I'm going to fix what's broken, James said with conviction, starting with Scott Blackwell. Eduardo shook his head. It's not just Scott. It's a whole system that values numbers over people. That sees loyalty as a weakness rather than a strength. That wastes potential because it doesn't fit into the right box. You're right, James acknowledged. And that's my fault. I lost sight of what matters. But I want to change it. It's too late, Eduardo said, though with less certainty. I've already accepted a position here. Junior engineer. Not exactly what I'm qualified for, but at least they recognize I have something to offer beyond pushing a broom. James nodded, understanding. May I ask what you told them in your interview about your ideas? Eduardo hesitated, then explained. I showed them my designs for modifying the conveyor system, the one Scott dismissed. It would reduce jams by 60% and cut maintenance costs. The one you've been trying to get someone to look at for years, James remembered. 3 years, Eduardo confirmed. I've submitted it through proper channels 7 times. It always disappears into a black hole. James was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if you had the resources to implement that design, and others you've developed? Eduardo looked at him suspiciously. What are you suggesting? I'm offering you a job, a real one, that uses your skills and experience. Maintenance engineering, specialist, reporting directly to the head of operations. That position doesn't exist, Eduardo pointed out. It does now, James replied. I'm the CEO, remember? I can create positions. Eduardo didn't respond immediately, weighing the offer. And Scott? Will no longer be in a position to ignore good ideas or disrespect employees, James said firmly. That I promise you. Why should I believe anything will really change? Eduardo asked. Companies always talk about valuing employees when they're about to lose them. Then everything goes back to normal a week later. It was a fair question, and one James had asked himself throughout the sleepless night. Because I'm not just promising changes. I'm going to make them, publicly and permanently, starting Monday morning. Eduardo still looked unconvinced. Valencia is offering me a fresh start. No history, no being seen as just the maintenance guy. Why risk staying at Sunrise? Because you built Sunrise too, James said simply. 15 years of your life went into our success. Your identity is in our products, our systems, our culture, the good parts of it anyway. And because I need people like you to help me rebuild what's been lost. For the first time, Eduardo seemed to be truly considering the offer. What exactly would this new position entail? You'd lead a team focused on implementing maintenance innovations across all facilities, Your first project would be your conveyor system redesign. You'd have budget authority and direct input on hiring. And if I said I needed a team of engineers with diverse backgrounds, people whose credentials might not check all the traditional boxes. James nodded, understanding what Eduardo was really asking. Especially those people. We've clearly been missing out on talent because we've been looking in too narrow a field. Eduardo was quiet for a long moment, then said, I already gave Valencia my word. I understand, James said, disappointed but not surprised. Some things matter more than business opportunities, like integrity. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm still going to make those changes. You showed me what needs fixing, I won't forget that. Eduardo looked up at him. The others, the line workers, the maintenance crew, the people who've been treated like they're disposable, what happens to them? I can't fix everything overnight, James admitted. But I can start creating a company where they're respected, where their ideas matter, where loyalty is valued again. As James turned to walk away, Eduardo called after him. Mr. Mercer. James looked back. I haven't signed Valencia's contract yet, Eduardo said carefully. I told them I'd give my final answer on Monday. Hope flickered in James's chest. Then I have until Monday to prove I'm serious. Eduardo stood. Yes, you do. There was a challenge in his eyes, but also something else. A cautious optimism that James hadn't seen since the photo on the conference room wall. I won't let you down, James promised. Not again. As he drove home, James's mind was racing with plans. He had one weekend to redesign company policies, prepare for a confrontation with Scott, and create a framework for the changes he'd promised. It seemed impossible. But the alternative, losing Eduardo and all the others like him, watching his company continue down this path where human potential was wasted, that was truly impossible to accept. He picked up his phone and called Raj. Cancel everything on my calendar for the weekend, and get Tom and Diane to meet me at the office in 1 hour. We have work to do. The undercover operation is over? Raj asked. No, James replied. It's just beginning. Monday morning arrived with a buzz of unusual energy throughout the Oakland facility. Rumors had spread over the weekend. Something big was happening. An all-hands meeting had been called for 9 a.m. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. Workers gathered in the largest assembly area. Production lines temporarily halted. They stood in groups exchanging theories about the sudden meeting. Maybe we're being sold, one worker speculated. Could be layoffs, another said grimly. Numbers haven't been great this quarter. Scott Blackwell moved through the crowd with an air of confidence, stopping occasionally to speak with his favorite supervisors. Nothing to worry about, he assured them loudly enough for others to hear. Probably just another corporate pep talk. I'll fill you in later on what really matters. At precisely 9 a.m., Diane from HR stepped onto the temporary platform at the front of the room. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, our CEO James Mercer has an important announcement. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The CEO himself here at the Oakland plant without weeks of advance notice and preparation? This was unprecedented. James walked onto the platform wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks. No tie, no suit jacket, nothing to create distance between himself and the workers. He looked different somehow, more present, more connected to the room. Good morning, he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. I know many of you haven't seen me in person for a long time. That's the first thing I want to apologize for today. The crowd fell silent, caught off guard by the unexpected opening. For the past week, I've been working here among you, James continued. Not as your CEO, but as a maintenance worker named Mark Johnson. Gasps and whispers erupted as people turned to each other in shock. On instinct, many eyes turned toward Eduardo, who stood quietly near the back of the room, his face unreadable. I wanted to see our company as it really is, not as it's presented to me in reports and carefully managed tours, James explained. What I discovered was both inspiring and deeply troubling. He paused, making eye contact with workers throughout the room. I saw incredible dedication, people who cared deeply about their work and this company. I saw innovation and ideas at every level. I saw the heart of what makes Sunrise successful. Some workers nodded, standing a little straighter. But I also saw a company that has lost its way. James continued, his voice growing more serious. I saw talented people being ignored. I saw loyalty being treated as a liability rather than an asset. I saw a culture where respect flows in only one direction, and that ends today. Scott Blackwell shifted uncomfortably near the front of the room, his earlier confidence fading. Effective immediately, I'm announcing several changes, James said. First, we're creating a new innovation department, led by people from every level of the company who have demonstrated creativity and problem-solving skills, regardless of their current position or educational background. He gestured toward Eduardo. Eduardo Torres has agreed to head this department as our new maintenance engineering specialist. His first project will be implementing his conveyor system redesign, which is projected to reduce jams by 60% and significantly cut maintenance costs. All eyes turned to Eduardo, who looked as surprised as everyone else. Clearly, he hadn't expected a public announcement. For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Second, James continued, we're revamping our feedback system. Every idea, every suggestion will be logged and tracked from submission to implementation or rejection. And if rejected, a detailed explanation will be provided. No more ideas disappearing into black holes. Workers exchange glances, cautious hope beginning to replace skepticism. Third, we're instituting a mentorship program for employees with unrecognized qualifications or skills. If you have education or experience that isn't being utilized in your current role, we want to know about it. As James spoke, Scott edged closer to the exit, sensing where this might be heading. And finally, James said, his voice growing firmer, we're addressing our management culture. Sunrise was founded on values of respect, innovation, and community. Somewhere along the way, some of us, myself included, lost sight of that. He looked directly at Scott now. Regional Manager Scott Blackwell, please join me on stage. Scott froze, caught halfway between his position and the door. Reluctantly, he made his way to the platform, attempting to maintain a confident demeanor, though his face had paled noticeably. Scott, your production numbers have been impressive, James acknowledged. But I've personally witnessed how those numbers have been achieved through intimidation, through dismissing valuable input, through creating a culture of fear rather than collaboration. Scott's expression hardened. With all due respect, sir, results speak for themselves. My methods work. Do they? James challenged. Our turnover rate is at an all-time high. Training costs are skyrocketing. And we've lost countless good ideas because people were afraid to speak up or simply gave up trying. He turned back to the audience. Scott will be transitioning to a new role effective immediately. He'll be working with our training department to develop leadership skills that align with our company values. He will have no direct reports until he has completed this program and demonstrated a commitment to respectful leadership. Scott's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he said nothing, aware of hundreds of eyes watching his reaction. We've also created a new position of employee advocate who will report directly to me, James continued. This person will be your voice in executive meetings, ensuring your concerns and ideas reach the highest levels of the company. He looked around the room, taking in the mixture of surprise, hope, and lingering skepticism on people's faces. I know announcements are easy. Changes are hard. You have no reason to believe things will actually be different based on my words alone. James stepped away from the microphone and walked down from the platform, moving into the crowd. That's why I'm not going back to headquarters today. I'll be here, working alongside you for the next month as we implement these changes. Not undercover this time, as your CEO, learning what you do, understanding your challenges, and making sure your voices are heard. He stopped near Eduardo. I've learned more about this company in 1 week on the floor than in 5 years in my office. That changes now too. Every quarter I'll spend a week working in a different department at each of our facilities. Not for show, but to stay connected to the heart of this company. All of you. The assembly area had fallen completely, Silent, workers processing the unprecedented announcements. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap. Others joined in, slowly at first, then building to a thunderous applause that filled the entire space. As people were dismissed to return to work, a transformed energy moved through the building. Workers clustered in small groups discussing the announcement, some skeptical but many cautiously optimistic about the promised changes. Eduardo approached James as the crowd dispersed. "That was unexpected," he said quietly. "In a good way, I hope," James replied. Eduardo studied him for a moment. "You're really going to stay and work on the floor? For a month?" "Starting today," James confirmed. "I meant what I said, Eduardo. I need to understand how this company actually works. The good, the bad, all of it. And my position? That wasn't just for show." "Your office is being prepared as we speak," James said. "You'll have budget authority, a team, everything we discussed, plus something else. I want you to help me identify others like you, people whose talents we've been wasting." For the first time since they'd met, Eduardo smiled fully. "There are quite a few, actually. We talk during breaks sometimes, share ideas that no one else wants to hear." James nodded. "I want to meet all of them, today if possible." As they walked through the facility together, workers stared openly, adjusting to the strange sight of the CEO in conversation with a maintenance worker as equals. Some approached hesitantly with questions, growing bolder when James stopped to listen attentively to each one. By late afternoon, news of the morning's events had spread to every corner of the company. James's phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and executives, some concerned, others intrigued by the bold moves. He responded to only the most urgent, focusing instead on the conversations happening around him on the factory floor. At the end of the day, James found himself back in the maintenance area, watching as Eduardo gathered his personal items from his locker. "Having second thoughts?" James asked, noticing Eduardo's thoughtful expression. Eduardo shook his head. "Just remembering something my father used to say, that change only matters if it lasts. The real test isn't today or tomorrow. It's what happens in 6 months, in a year." "He's right," James acknowledged. "And that's exactly why I need people like you in leadership positions, to hold me accountable, to speak up when we start sliding back into old habits." Eduardo closed his locker for the final time. "Then I guess we have work to do." 6 months later, James stood in the Oakland facility again, though under very different circumstances. The quarterly all-hands meeting had become a tradition now, a time for celebrating successes and addressing ongoing challenges openly. Eduardo's conveyor system redesign had been fully implemented, reducing equipment downtime by 30% and becoming a model for the company's other locations. More importantly, the mentorship program he championed had identified 23 employees with untapped skills and education, all of whom were now in new roles that better utilized their abilities. Scott Blackwell had ultimately left the company, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture. Few missed his leadership style, though many acknowledged his technical skills. In his place, a team-based management approach had emerged with decisions made collaboratively, rather than handed down from above. As James looked out at the assembled workers, he saw something that had been missing during his undercover days, a sense of ownership and pride that went beyond just collecting a paycheck. People stood taller, spoke more confidently, and challenged ideas regardless of who presented them. After the meeting, James joined Eduardo for lunch in the cafeteria, another new tradition. They sat at the same corner table where they had eaten, as Mark and Eduardo months before. Valencia called again, Eduardo mentioned casually between bites. "Offering me a director position now." James raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" Eduardo smiled. "I told them I'm exactly where I need to be. They asked what it would take to change my mind. And," James prompted, "I said it would take a company that values its people as much as its profits, that listens as much as it directs, that sees potential everywhere, not just in the expected places." Eduardo shrugged. "They said they're working on it. Apparently our changes here have been noticed by the competition." James laughed. Good. Maybe we'll start a trend. As they finished lunch and prepared to return to work, Eduardo paused. You know, I almost didn't come that Monday. Almost took Valencia's first offer. What changed your mind? James asked, though he had a feeling he knew the answer. I needed to see if you meant what you said, Eduardo replied simply. Words are easy. Actions matter. James nodded, understanding completely. Speaking of actions, I believe I have a floor to sweep. It's my week in maintenance, after all. Eduardo grinned. The new guy always gets the worst jobs. They walked back to the production floor together, CEO and engineer, former undercover boss and former janitor, now partners in something neither could have imagined just 6 months before, a company being rebuilt on respect, recognition, and the revolutionary idea that every person, regardless of title or background, had something valuable to contribute. The real undercover boss operation, James reflected as he picked up a broom, hadn't been about disguising himself to see the truth. It had been about removing the disguises the company had been hiding behind for years. The polished reports, the managed impressions, the illusion that titles mattered more than ideas. Some lessons he had discovered could only be learned by sweeping the floor,